On the morning of the 12th of April 1981, 14-year-old Sheila Sharp walked the short distance from cabin 27 to cabin 28 at the Keddie Resort in California's Sierra Nevada mountains. She had spent the night at a friend's house next door and was returning home to change clothes before church. It was approximately 7:30 a.m. on a Sunday morning. The sun was already up, filtering through the tall pines that surrounded the small resort community. Sheila opened the front door to her family's cabin and stepped inside. What she saw in those first seconds would haunt her for the rest of her life. In the small living room, 3 bodies lay in pools of blood. Her mother, 36-year-old Glenna Sue Sharp, was on the floor near the sofa. Her 15-year-old brother John was nearby, and John's friend, 17-year-old Dana Wingate, who had been staying over, lay dead beside them. All 3 had been bound with electrical cord and medical tape. All 3 had been beaten and stabbed. Sheila screamed and ran back to cabin 27, where she had spent the night. The neighbors called the Plumas County Sheriff's Office. When deputies arrived at the scene, they found something almost as disturbing as the murders themselves. 2 of Sheila's younger brothers, 12-year-old Rick and 10-year-old Greg, had been asleep in an adjacent bedroom throughout the entire attack. They had slept through the murders of their mother, brother, and his friend. They were physically unharmed. And Sheila's youngest sibling, 5-year-old Tina, was missing. Welcome to Vanishing Threads. Today we're exploring the Keddie Murders, one of the most brutal unsolved crimes in American history. 4 people were killed in a remote mountain cabin in 1981, yet the crime scene was left virtually undisturbed for hours, evidence was mishandled, and crucial leads were ignored. For more than 40 years, the case has been marked by allegations of cover-ups, incompetence, and interference. Despite a 2013 reopening of the investigation and new evidence pointing to specific suspects, no one has ever been charged. The Keddie murders remain unsolved, a testament to how badly a murder investigation can fail. Keddie was a tiny railroad town in Plumas County, California, nestled in the Sierra Nevada mountains about 150 miles northeast of Sacramento. In 1981, the population was approximately 66 people. The Keddie Resort was a collection of small cabins that had been built in the 1910s to house railroad workers. By the 1970s, it had become low-income housing, renting to families who couldn't afford better accommodation. The Sharp family had moved to Keddie in the autumn of 1980. Sue Sharp was a single mother who had recently separated from her husband, James Sharp, after years of domestic violence. She had 5 children: John, 15, Sheila, 14, Tina, 12, Rick, 10, and Greg, 5. They had moved from Connecticut to escape James and start fresh in California. Sue had found work at the Quincy Greenville Hospital as a nursing assistant. Cabin 28 was small, just 2 bedrooms for a family of 6. But it was affordable, and Sue was doing her best to provide for her children. On the evening of the 11th of April, 1981, a Saturday, the family had a quiet night at home. John's friend Dana Wingate, who lived in cabin 27 next door with his mother, came over to spend the night. Sheila went next door to cabin 27 for a sleepover with Dana's sister and other friends. The younger boys, Rick and Greg, went to bed in their shared bedroom. Sue, John, Dana, and Tina remained in the living room area. Sometime between 10 p.m. on the 11th and 7 a.m. on the 12th, someone entered cabin 28 and committed one of the most savage homicides in California history. When Plumas County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the scene on the morning of 12th of April, they found a crime scene of extraordinary brutality. Sue Sharp had been bound with electrical cord and medical tape. She had been beaten and stabbed multiple times. The pathologist would later count 7 stab wounds to her chest and throat. The violence inflicted upon her was extreme and personal. John Sharp, Sue's 15-year-old son, had also been bound. He had been struck and stabbed with the knife as well. His injuries were catastrophic. Dana Wingate, John's friend, had fought back. There were defensive wounds on his hands and arms, suggesting he had tried to protect himself. He too had suffered the same fate. All 3 victims had been killed in the small living room of the cabin. The weapons used in the murders were found at the scene: a claw hammer and a steak knife from Sue's own kitchen, along with a bent butcher knife. Investigators also found a wooden-handled kitchen knife that had been bent at a 30-degree angle, suggesting the force with which it had been used. Crucially, there was no sign of forced entry. Whoever had entered cabin 28 that night had either been let in or had a key. The door had been locked from the inside when Sheila arrived in the morning, suggesting the killer had left through the back door. In the bedroom where Rick and Greg had been sleeping, investigators found the boys unharmed but deeply traumatized. They claimed to have heard nothing during the night. The bedroom door had been covered with a blanket, possibly to muffle sound or prevent the boys from seeing what was happening in the living room. Why the killer had left them alive remains one of the many mysteries of the case. 12-year-old Tina Sharp was nowhere to be found. Her blankets were missing from the living room couch where she had been sleeping. Investigators immediately suspected she had been abducted, possibly as a witness to the murders. An extensive search of the surrounding area was launched, but no trace of Tina was found. The initial investigation was led by Plumas County Sheriff Sylvester Douglas Thomas and his deputies. From the beginning, the investigation was marked by errors and oversights that would later be described as catastrophic. The crime scene was not properly secured. Curious neighbors and even members of the press were allowed to walk through cabin 28 in the hours after the discovery. Evidence was not properly logged. Photographs were not taken of crucial items. Potential witnesses were not interviewed thoroughly. Most damningly, the crime scene itself was left largely undisturbed for hours. The bodies remained in the cabin while investigators processed the scene at a leisurely pace. By the time the bodies were finally removed, contamination of the crime scene was extensive. Blood evidence that might have identified the killer was compromised. Fingerprints were smudged or destroyed. Within days of the murders, two suspects emerged, Martin Smart and John Bubede. Smart lived in cabin 26, just 2 doors down from the Sharp family. He was a troubled man with a history of violence and heavy drinking. His wife Marilyn had recently left him, taking their children. Smart had become obsessed with Sue Sharp in the months before the murders, making inappropriate comments about her to neighbors. Some witnesses reported that Smart had expressed anger that Sue had rebuffed his advances. John Bubede, known as Bo, was Smart's friend and had been staying with him in cabin 26. Bo was an ex-convict with a violent past. He was large and intimidating, and neighbors reported being afraid of him. On the night of the murders, both Smart and Bo were allegedly at a bar in Quincy until late. However, their alibis were never properly verified. In the days following the murders, several witnesses reported seeing Smart and Bo acting strangely. Smart's wife Marilyn later told investigators that her husband had confessed to her that he and Bo were involved in the murders. She claimed Smart had said, "I didn't have anything to do with the boys," suggesting he had killed Sue and Tina, but not John and Dana. However, Marilyn's statements were not taken seriously by investigators at the time, possibly because she was in the process of divorcing Smart and was considered a biased witness. A counselor whom Smart had been seeing also came forward with disturbing information. Smart had allegedly told the counselor that he had killed Sue and Tina, claiming Tina had been killed because she was a witness. Again, this information was not properly followed up by investigators. Despite the mounting evidence against Smart and Bo, neither man was ever arrested. The investigation stalled. Sheriff Thomas seemed reluctant to pursue the case aggressively. Rumors began to circulate in Keddie that there was a cover-up, that someone in law enforcement was protecting the killers. Some speculated that Smart had connections to local officials. Others suggested that Bo had ties to organized crime and that investigators were afraid to pursue him. For 3 years, the fate of Tina Sharp remained unknown. Then, on the 22nd of April, 1984, almost exactly 3 years after the murders, a man named Ronald Pedrini was out collecting bottles near Feather Falls in neighboring Butte County, approximately 30 miles from Keddie. In a remote area near Camp 18, Pedrini found a human skull partially buried in the soil. The skull was sent to the California Department of Justice for analysis. Forensic pathologists determined it belonged to a young girl, approximately 12 years old. Dental records confirmed it was Tina Sharp. Along with the skull, investigators found a few other items: a child's blanket, a blue nylon jacket, and a pair of jeans with a missing back pocket. The rest of Tina's remains were never found. The condition of the skull suggested Tina had been killed shortly after the murders in Cabin 28, likely within hours or days. She had been struck on the head with a blunt object, consistent with the hammer used in the other murders. Her body had been dumped in the remote location and left to decompose. The discovery of Tina's remains brought no new leads. The investigation remained stalled. In 1988, an anonymous phone call was made to the Butte County Sheriff's Office. The caller, whose voice was recorded, provided specific details about the Keddie murders that had never been made public. The caller suggested that the murders were connected to a drug operation and that Tina's body had been moved to Butte County to throw off investigators. The tape of this call was found years later at the bottom of an evidence box, but the caller was never identified. For decades, the case went cold. Cabin 28 fell into disrepair and was eventually demolished in 2004. The Keddie Resort itself became a ghost town, a symbol of the tragedy that had destroyed the community. Sheila Sharp, who had discovered her family's bodies, struggled with trauma and survivor's guilt. Her younger brothers, Rick and Greg, tried to move on with their lives but were forever marked by the night they slept through their family's murder. Then, in 2013, the case was reopened. Plumas County Sheriff Greg Hagwood, who had been a teenager in Keddie at the time of the murders and had known Tina Sharp personally, made it his mission to solve the case. He brought in Special Investigator Mike Gamberg, a retired law enforcement officer with extensive experience in cold cases. Together, they began to re-examine the evidence with fresh eyes. What Hagwood and Gamberg found was shocking. The original investigation had been even more incompetent than anyone had realized. Crucial evidence had never been properly analyzed. Witness statements had been ignored or lost. Evidence had been stored improperly, with items from the crime scene mixed together in boxes, making it impossible to maintain chain of custody. Most significantly, Hagwood and Gamberg discovered that evidence had been deliberately withheld or destroyed. A hammer that matched the description of the murder weapon had been found in a pond near Cabin 28 shortly after the murders, but had never been properly tested. Tape recordings of witness interviews had gone missing. Photographs of the crime scene had been lost or destroyed. Hagwood and Gamberg focused their investigation on Martin Smart and John Bubede. By 2013, both men were dead. Smart had died in 2000 and Bubede had died in 1988, but the investigators believed they could still build a case that would provide closure to the victims' families. In 2016, Hagwood and Gamberg announced they had found new evidence. A piece of medical tape recovered from the crime scene in 1981 had finally been tested for DNA. The results showed a match to a living person who had been in Keddie at the time of the murders. Investigators refused to name the person publicly, citing the ongoing investigation, but they stated they believed they knew who had committed the murders. In 2018, further DNA evidence was announced. Investigators stated they had recovered DNA from multiple items at the crime scene that matched known suspects. They expressed confidence that the case was solvable and that arrests could be made. However, as of 2025, no arrests have been made. The investigation remains open, but appears to have stalled once again. The Keddie murders have become a symbol of justice denied. The case is frequently cited as an example of how law enforcement failures can allow killers to escape justice. The mishandling of evidence, the failure to pursue obvious suspects, and the allegations of cover-up have made the case a source of frustration for true crime researchers and the victims' families alike. Sheila Sharp has spent decades advocating for justice for her family. She has given numerous interviews, participated in documentaries, and worked with investigators to keep the case in the public eye. In interviews, she has expressed frustration with the original investigation and hope that the 2013 reopening will finally bring answers. The surviving Sharp brothers, Rick and Greg, have largely stayed out of the public eye, but they have supported efforts to solve the case. The trauma of that night, sleeping through the murders of their mother, brother, and sister's friend, waking to find their sister Tina missing, has shaped their entire lives. The case has been featured in numerous true crime documentaries, podcasts, and books. In 2016, Investigation Discovery aired a special titled Cabin 28: Horror in the Woods. In 2017, a documentary called Cabin 28 was released. The case has been covered extensively on true crime podcasts, with amateur sleuths offering their own theories about what happened that night. The most widely accepted theory is that Martin Smart and John Boobedy committed the murders, possibly with the help of one or more accomplices. The motive was likely Smart's obsession with Sue Sharp and his rage at being rejected by her. Tina was abducted and killed because she witnessed the murders and could identify the killers. The two younger boys were left alive either because the killers didn't realize they were in the cabin or because they decided not to harm young children. Alternative theories have been proposed. Some believe the murders were connected to organized crime or drug trafficking. Others suggest that Sue Sharp was targeted because she knew something dangerous or had witnessed something she shouldn't have. A few researchers have proposed that the murders were committed by someone entirely different, and that Smart and Bo were convenient scapegoats. The allegations of a cover-up remain controversial. Some believe that Sheriff Thomas deliberately sabotaged the investigation to protect Smart, possibly because Smart had connections to local officials, or because Thomas himself was involved in some way. Others believe the investigation was simply incompetent, not malicious, and that the failures were the result of a small-town sheriff's department being overwhelmed by a complex murder case. What is certain is that the investigation was catastrophically mishandled. Evidence was lost, contaminated, or destroyed. Witnesses were not properly interviewed. Obvious suspects were not thoroughly investigated. The crime scene was left unsecured for hours, allowing contamination that made forensic analysis nearly impossible. The Keddie Resort no longer exists. The cabins have been demolished or abandoned. The site where Cabin 28 once stood is now an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. A historical marker notes the location, but there is no memorial to the victims. The community of Keddie itself has never recovered from the murders. The population has dwindled, and the town is largely forgotten, except as the site of an infamous unsolved crime. For the families of the victims, the lack of justice is a wound that never heals. Sue Sharp was a mother trying to protect her children from an abusive husband, only to be murdered in her own home. John Sharp was a 15-year-old boy killed alongside his mother. Dana Wingate was a 17-year-old who died trying to defend his friend's family. Tina Sharp was a 12-year-old girl abducted and murdered, her body dumped in the woods like garbage. The Keddie murders stand as a reminder of how fragile justice can be. When law enforcement fails, whether through incompetence, corruption, or indifference, killers go free and families are left without answers. The case also demonstrates the importance of proper evidence handling and thorough investigation. The failures of the original investigation have made it nearly impossible to prosecute anyone for the murders, even with modern DNA technology. In recent years, advances in forensic genealogy have offered new hope. The same techniques used to identify the Golden State Killer and other cold case suspects could potentially be applied to the Keddie murders. DNA recovered from the crime scene could be run through genealogical databases to identify relatives of the killer, potentially leading to a definitive identification. However, the passage of time works against justice. Witnesses have died, memories have faded, evidence has degraded. The two primary suspects, Smart and Bo, are both dead and can never be brought to trial. Even if investigators definitively prove their guilt, there can be no criminal prosecution, no trial, no conviction. The best the victims' families can hope for is confirmation of what they have long suspected. The case has also raised questions about the nature of evil and violence. What kind of person could commit such brutal murders? What could drive someone to beat and stab 3 people to death, then abduct and kill a 12-year-old girl? The level of violence in the Keddie murders suggests rage, personal hatred, and a complete lack of empathy. Whether that violence came from Smart's obsession with Sue Sharp, from Bo's criminal past, or from some other source, it left 4 people dead and a community destroyed. The Keddie murders also highlight the vulnerability of single mothers and their children. Sue Sharp had fled an abusive marriage and was trying to build a new life for her family. She was working hard, raising 5 children on her own, living in a small cabin in a remote mountain town. She should have been safe. Instead, she became the victim of a brutal murder, and her children were left orphaned or dead. For true crime researchers and amateur sleuths, the Keddie murders remain one of the most frustrating unsolved cases in American history. The evidence pointing to Smart and Boubeid is substantial, yet no arrest was ever made. The mishandling of the investigation is well documented, yet no one was ever held accountable for those failures. The case seems solvable, yet it remains unsolved. As the years pass, the likelihood of a resolution diminishes. Witnesses continue to die. Evidence continues to degrade. The window for justice grows smaller, yet the case refuses to fade from public consciousness. New documentaries are made, new podcasts cover the story, new researchers examine the evidence. The Keddie murders have become part of American true crime folklore, a cautionary tale about the importance of competent law enforcement and the devastating consequences when justice fails. In a remote corner of a California cemetery, Sue Sharp, John Sharp, and Dana Wingate are buried. Tina Sharp's partial remains were laid to rest beside her mother and brother. Their graves are visited occasionally by family members and by true crime enthusiasts who want to pay their respects. The headstones are simple, marking lives cut short by violence. The Keddie murders remain unsolved. The killers, whether Smart and Boubeid or someone else entirely, were never brought to justice. 4 people died brutal deaths, and no one has ever been held accountable. It is a failure of the justice system, a failure of law enforcement, and a failure of a community that allowed a crime scene to be contaminated and crucial evidence to be lost. For Sheila Sharp and her surviving brothers, the hope for justice never dies. They continue to advocate for the case to remain open, for investigators to continue pursuing leads, for someone to finally be held accountable. They deserve answers. They deserve justice. They deserve to know that their mother, brother, sister, and friend did not die in vain. The Keddie murders stand as a testament to how some crimes can haunt a community forever. The small mountain town of Keddie was destroyed by the murders, its reputation forever tainted by the violence that occurred there. The case serves as a reminder that evil can strike anywhere, even in the most remote and peaceful places. And it serves as a warning about the importance of competent, thorough, and honest law enforcement. When the system fails, justice is denied and the victims are forgotten. Thank you for tuning in, and as always, stay curious, stay safe.